If you're a regular Geek's Guide to the Galaxy listener, please rate and review us on iTunes or using the podcast app on your phone. We currently have 922 5-star ratings, and it would be great to get that up to 1,000. And so I want to give a special thank you to Leonard Satangia, who just gave us this 5-star review. Episode 433 is a joy to hear. Every podcast is wonderful in the show, and David is such a good interviewer, but this one on the Bill and Ted trilogy is another level. Everyone on the panel and David are a joy to listen to as they casually converse as old friends, who are also brilliantly knowledgeable about the subject. It just puts everything together with a good fun subject to create a masterpiece of expression. So big thanks again to Leonard Satangia for that great review. Alright, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 441 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show we'll be discussing dreams in science fiction, and this may include spoilers for the books and movies we discuss, including The Cell, Inception, Coma, and The Lathe of Heaven, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by 3 guests. So first up, we've got Anthony Ha, making his 22nd appearance on the show. He covers media, advertising, and pop culture for TechCrunch, where he also hosts the podcast Original Content. A chapbook of his short stories called Love Songs for Monsters was published by Youth in Decline in 2014, and his short story Late Train appeared in the February 2019 issue of Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet. So Anthony, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
The next up, we've got Sara Lynn Michener, making her 19th appearance on the show. She's a trans-supporting Ravenclaw Trekkie maker feminist who writes at Medium and lives in Connecticut with a Renaissance engineer and a small zoo. So Sara, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
And also joining us today is Lisa Yaszek, making her 6th appearance on the show. She's Regents Professor of Science Fiction Studies at Georgia Tech, and is author of the nonfiction books Galactic Suburbia, Sisters of Tomorrow, and The Future is Female. She also appears in the AMC miniseries James Cameron's Story of Science Fiction. So Lisa, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
Okay, so when it comes to dreams in science fiction, I think the movie Inception is probably the best known example. So Anthony, do you think that Inception deserves to be the #1 dreams in science fiction movie?
I think that's fair, in the sense that it is, just well executed and I think explores the idea in interesting ways. I mean, I do have reservations about the film, which we can also talk about, but what has been striking to me as we've had the preparation for this episode is also how there just isn't quite as much as I would have expected, that there's so much dream fantasy fiction, and certainly there is a number of science fiction examples too, but it seems a lot less, that they're just, it's like the #1 in a relatively limited field.
Well, yeah, it's in a relatively limited field, and not all of the entries in that field are particularly strong either.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so how about Sara? What do you think about Inception #1?
I think it's one of those things where deserve is a whole other, it's a very loaded term, but I think I can understand why it would be seen culturally that way. I mean, when we all saw the movie the first time, it was just utterly mind-blowing. And it was really, I think one of the strengths with it is that, it in a lot of ways, it was a very technical film that was, you really had to pay close attention to follow it. But at the same time, they really didn't shirk on character development. Like, for example, the whole scenario with Leo DiCaprio, his character Cobb, talking about the trauma that he went through with his wife. And I have used this example or talked about this movie in therapy multiple times, where you're sort of going down into the basement of your subconscious to deal with this thing that is so painful that it's actually something that you fear. There's a ton of sort of this mammalian fear response. And I remember feeling that for the character while watching the film. So it just feels like one of those movies where it's so dense. It has a lot of rich character development and, talks about ideas bigger, I think, than even just the mindfuckery that exists as structurally for the plot.
Yeah. I mean, I think Inception's super cool. I mean, I remembered liking it. I remembered actually I thought the snow battle went on a little, kind of dragged on a little too long, but otherwise I remembered liking it, quite a bit. And I especially like I've watched so many movies recently where I really had to struggle to get through them. And I had no trouble getting through Inception on rewatch. And I was sort of struck by just how much of the movie is exposition, is sort of explaining the sort of arbitrary, sort of nonsensical rules of this world, but it's like riveting the whole time. There's just something so stylish and inventive about it that I forgive it all of its exposition. And somebody said you have to pay attention to follow what's going on. Even paying attention, I'm not sure I really follow what's going on, but I still enjoy it quite a bit. So how about Lisa? How do you feel about Inception, #1 dreams and science fiction movie?
I'm with everything everyone's already said. I can see why a lot of people see it as a really major cultural touchstone. And I agree with Anthony. You'd think there would be more science fiction dream stories, but I think, in a world where we have cyberspace, you have other ways and to represent the virtual and the fantastic. So you don't get that many. I think this is good. I've watched it 4 times now. I still can't figure out the plot. And, but I like that. That's cool. I think that's cool. I don't know if I would say it's #1 alone, though. I feel like, obviously it's a small group, but I feel that a number of the dream movies that have come out recently and that we were talking about as we prepped for this, like The Cell, and which is actually older, and the Coma, which is new, I think that they have almost as much merit in some ways in terms of style and thinking through big ideas. And visually, The Cell, you guys, is so pretty. I mean, my vote has to go for that just because the costumes and the visuals and, these are dreams. And I want to see lush, dreamlike visuals with them. And they all have beautiful visuals, but The Cell will always have my heart because of Jennifer Lopez's outfits, and that's just where I'm at.
So on Rotten Tomatoes, Inception is 87%, and The Cell and Coma are 45% and 43%. So critics seem to think that Inception is quite a bit better than those other two. Do you think, Lisa, that the critics are just wrong, or do you sort of see where they're coming from?
No. Oh, I see 100% where they're coming from. And I'm sure that what everyone likes about Inception is just what everyone likes about every PKD movie, is that it's super sexy and we don't know what the real reality is at the end. Whereas like in The Cell, you're pretty clear where baseline reality is. So, it's in some ways, I think Inception has that more sort of new wavy vibe that film people really like, and that open kind of ending. And that's perfectly cool. But I do think people right now value those kinds of stories with those endings where you don't know what's going on more than one that has a pretty clear ending. And both The Cell and Coma, you know where the reality is at the end for sure. So I see it, and that's cool. I'm just not going to give up on my own personal opinion here. I'm for the underdogs, I guess.
Well, I think The Cell and Coma might be, sufficiently less well known that I should just explain the premise for people who might not have seen them. So in The Cell, there's a serial killer who's in a coma, and Jennifer Lopez has to kind of like go into his mind, into his dreams, to try to get clues about where he's there's a woman that he's abducted, and so that the police so the FBI can find her. And then Coma, which is a recent Russian movie, the premise is that if you're in a coma, your mind goes to this sort of fantasy world, and everyone who's in a coma ends up in the same place, where the world is constructed out of memories. So there's all these like just weird buildings floating in the sky, and just whatever bits of geography that people remember are all just kind of like glued together in weird fractal patterns. And actually both Coma and The Cell have amazing visuals, as you mentioned, Lisa.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you have to give them credit in that department. But
yeah.
Going back to Sarah, what did you think? How do you think that Coma and The Cell compare to Inception?
I agree with that. I think that one of the things I really appreciated about The Cell is that, it's in so many ways, especially the the present day scenes, right? They feel super dated. Like, I remember going to see The Cell with my sister, 20 years ago, however long it's been. And when I rewatched it, this month, it was like, wow, okay, 20 years is a really long time, because you get that sense that, time, it's like the slow motion shot of the FBI running with, their suits flapping in the wind. Like, I was like, oh, come on. Like, there was this sort of like 90s ultra cool idea of the FBI that's baked into that movie. And so stuff like that ends up pretty dated, especially since we now have a little bit more of a sophisticated idea of those things. But, the dreams, though, could have been filmed yesterday as far as I'm concerned. Like, all of those sequences didn't feel dated at all, which, is surprising given how much, sort of early CGI was used. But I also really appreciated that The Cell did not take advantage of sort of victimization tropes. I kept expecting to be triggered, and I was not. Like, there were a lot of just the way that they created a villain who was not raping these characters and then putting them in these situations. Like, he had a very different way of being a villain, and of, still obviously being this horrible person and psychopath, but not in the tropey ways that have in many ways followed since. Even with the, Jennifer Lopez character, they didn't really put her together romantically with the Vince Vaughn character, I think, in the way that you would expect. And so I actually really appreciated that too, from a feminist perspective. They, they were not gratuitous in a movie that they
Right.
I certainly expected that.
Yeah, well, I mean, like you, Sarah, I saw The Cell when it came out, and I remembered it being not very good, but the dream sequences really stuck in my mind. And it was really striking going back and watching it, how I forgot that Vince Vaughn was in this movie. Like, it was really, I had forgotten that there was just how much of to see how much of the movie was just these really paint by numbers, run of the mill, serial killer hunt stuff. When I feel like the focus of the movie should have been much more on Jennifer Lopez and what's going on in the dreams, which, is what makes this movie distinctive, and is just, they apparently they drew on a bunch of real art, like art like paintings and sculptures and stuff for the dream sequences, and they're really, really striking.
Yeah.
I actually saw it's funny. There's one where she sees a horse chopped up into different sections. And I actually saw that piece. That was at the MoMA, I think. There was a big controversy over that whole exhibit.
Yeah.
That I don't know if I need to get into at the moment, but anyway, I think the movie should have focused more on dreams. So how about Anthony?
Yes.
What did you think? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that the dream sequences are really what make The Cell so memorable, and I can just still think of like specific imagery. Particularly, I think probably my favorite thing is just the way the serial killer, the Vincent D'Onofrio character, visualizes himself, and that he's like divided into these two different identities, but there's this sort of like God King in his own mind, and that was just so terrifying and beautiful at the same time. And I think there's just sequence after sequence like that in the film. And then there's this whole other movie that's mostly just a repeat of Silence of the Lambs. And, not necessarily badly done,
Yes.
but not done that well either. You're like, it's fine. I mean,
Yeah.
I would say my other criticism, and I wish that this had come through in the, found a way to do this in the dream sequences, was that the Jennifer Lopez character remains pretty much a cipher for me for most of the movie, or not a cipher, but she just is not, there's nothing particularly interesting about her character. You just get this kind of maternal protective side, but as a lead, I didn't find her that. I mean, Jennifer Lopez is incredibly charismatic, so I didn't mind that much, but for a film that is ostensibly an exploration of character, I didn't find any of the characters that memorable.
Yeah. What did you think, Anthony, of Coma? Just overall thoughts.
Oh, I liked it a lot. I was very skeptical just because I hadn't heard about it. And it had sort of two, at least the version that I rented on Fandango now, which is just like the default movie rental on a Roku TV, was dubbed and not dubbed particularly well. And it also has just obviously not top budget CGI. And so the whole thing has this kind of video gamey look to it. And so at first I was very, very resistant and thinking it wasn't going to be good. But once we started to see more of the world, once you just got used to the fact that the CGI had a slightly kind of, fake sheen to it, I thought like there were a lot of great images. There were a lot of really interesting ideas. I wasn't crazy about maybe the final act where there's some twists that I didn't find super interesting, but I'm glad I saw it. I actually liked it a lot more than I was expecting.
That's interesting because I actually kind of liked the twists toward the end, whereas sort of for the first half, I was like, oh, this is so derivative of the Matrix. I just couldn't get over that. I did think the one thing I really liked was the idea that so as I mentioned, they're in this Coma dream world, the shared world. And in this world, there are these kind of like oily monsters with glowing yellow eyes. And we find out that people who are brain dead, but who are being kept alive on life support appear in this world as these monsters. And I thought that was kind of an inventive idea. But Sarah, overall thoughts on Coma?
Yeah, I thought there were certainly some very interesting things about it, especially just the question of, for the people who were either severely disabled or severely depressed or whatever had caused them to, become abducted essentially and put in this position, that they chose to stay, that they wanted to stay. And I think that was one of the more interesting parts of the film. And it's almost a shame that we didn't get the reveal earlier and then have more of the film be about that fight, because that's, to me, when I think it got much, much more interesting, because I would have liked to see them explore that a little bit more.
I got to mention every time there's anything involving cults, got to have Sarah on to give her.
That's right. Now everybody's going to think I was in a cult. I was not in a cult. I just understand cults because I was raised religious.
Yeah, but did you like the cult, the way the cult, was that effective, you thought, the way the cult was portrayed in the movie?
Oh yeah, totally. It was really terrifying. I mean, one of my earliest dreams, I had a recurring dream when I was a child about what I can only imagine now was either hell or war or something in between. I just remember being surrounded by bodies. Some people were dead, some were in pain. And I had this dream multiple times, and as dark and as spooky as it was, I wasn't a part of it. I was an observer, feeling pity for the people around me. And I went to my mother and climbed into her lap and, told her what happened. And she held me, but she told me I was the victim of what she called, quote, spiritual warfare, and that the enemy, quote unquote, was out to get me, which is the devil. And, for a 5-6-year-old to hear this, expecting comfort, and getting the opposite, being told that the devil is after you and that's why you're having nightmares. I was fairly disturbed by that. And so, I've always been sort of fascinated by dreams, but I do think that sort of the way that people just buy into stuff entirely and bypass so many other logical processes in their brain and everything to really be committed to it is continually fascinating and terrifying to me.
It's interesting, Sarah, that you bring up like a real dream that you have, because there's this whole vocabulary in movies of what a dream is like. Like oftentimes there'll be doors with weird angles and like weirdly colored lights or like light shining from the background in a weird way and things like that. And I find like this never really captures to me what my dreams at least actually are like. And so I guess I'll just throw that out there. Lisa, do you feel like watching these movies, do you feel like, oh yeah, this is what a dream is like, or is there something that doesn't quite ring true about it?
No, I don't think it's at all what dreams are like. I mean, dreams are at some level, they're non-narrative. Like it's almost impossible to like narratively translate your experience of a dream to other people, right? And film has to give you, well, it doesn't have to give you a narrative, but the kinds of films we're talking about eventually do want to give you a narrative. So they don't feel at all alike to me. I agree with you. It feels like there's a lexicon for dreams or a grammar for it in certainly visual science fiction and possibly even print science fiction if I've thought about it. In fact, I know there's a grammar for it in print science fiction too. But I think that that's okay because we see it and we know that this is how we're translating a dream and it works pretty effectively. I think it draws a lot on Western traditions of like surrealism and things like that. So it may not be a universal representation of dreams the way we see them, but you know, it's cool. And I liked Coma. I want to go back because I didn't get a chance to talk about it. But as I was watching it, I just wanted to say I came up with the elevator pitch for it. You know how you got to have your 25-word elevator pitch? It was Coma is The Matrix meets Inception meets the Lego movie meets Doctor Strange meets the X-Men with a perfectly cynical Blade Runner type ending. and I kind of liked it actually for all those reasons. You know, like Dave, like you, like it's like I love the visuals. I actually like the janky kind of video game quality of it, Anthony. I think that would hail a lot of younger viewers actually, and it kind of hailed me as someone who thinks about video games. I think that becomes another way we signal dream these days is it looks like a video game or it looks like cyberspace, whatever that means to us. They're all those same non-spaces. So I kind of liked it. And then I got sick of all the tropes. And then I liked how they all turned around at the end. And I've been teaching some Russian science fiction, and I liked that there were some moments that felt to me very Russian. And I thought that was cool. It didn't feel 100% Western and familiar to me. And I dug that. I thought in a movie about dreams, that was perfect.
Could you give an example?
Yeah, I can actually. The guy who plays the soldier character who gets infected with the Reaper. And you know how at first you're like, okay, he's like the space jock or the science fiction soldier, and you know the character type, and then you're like, oh, okay, he's been infected. This is kind of like Lord of the Rings. Oh, I forgot to put Lord of the Rings in my elevator pitch. Shoot. But anyways, right? So then he's infected. But what I like is that in the end, he does this thing that you often see in both Soviet and Russian science fiction, where like the group is every bit as important in the narrative as the individuals. And he does this sort of things where, you know, he does the right thing in the end. And I loved how he became, I don't want to spoil the movie for people, but I love his final transformation at the end. I thought that it redeemed the character and sort of celebrated the communal ethos in a way you don't always see in American science fiction. I felt his character would have been punished in an American science fiction movie for going bad, even though it wasn't his fault. And I liked here that the movie recognized that he tried to do the right thing for the team. I thought that was cool, and it feels like a lot of Russian science fiction.
Yeah, it was actually this movie, and I hadn't heard anyone talk about it or seen any reviews or anything. I just came across it on iTunes, and I watched the trailer, and I was like, oh, this looks really cool. And, you know, it intrigued me that it was Russian, because other than Tarkovsky, I don't know if I can really think of that many Russian science fiction movies that I've seen. And so yeah, that's just what kind of got me thinking about all other dream science fiction things. But I want to come back to Anthony, because Anthony, you read 2 books for this, which I really appreciate.
That's right.
So you read The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula Le Guin and The Dream Master by Roger Zelazny. So I guess actually let's start with The Dream Master, because that's kind of, I wanted to talk about that in relation to The Cell, because they're both movies in which the sort of psychologist character goes into somebody else's dreams in an attempt to heal them. I mean, I guess that's just part of the story in The Cell, but how would you like contrast The Dream Master with The Cell?
I mean, I would say that they're probably about as different a treatment of that idea as you can imagine. I mean, even leaving aside the sort of difference in medium, where the dream sequences in The Cell are kind of what the whole thing is about. And it's about this sort of dive into the serial killer's psychology and into this sort of very kind of nightmarish space. And in the Dream Master, it felt much more, well, I mean, the character whose mind we're going into is very different because she's a woman who was born blind but wants to become sort of, I forget the exact name, but basically a shaper, a person who can also become this sort of like dream psychiatric doctor. And so she, in order to be able to do that, the current doctor is trying to introduce her to vision and to help her understand what it is to see. And so you get, there is this sort of unsettling quality to those sequences in the book where he creates environments for her, and then there's sort of a little bit of this subtle battle between their two desires, but it's, I think, much more quiet, especially in the beginning, where you don't get, giant monsters or scary scenes in that way. It's much more like, oh, that didn't go exactly the way I wanted it to. Oh, like why did this element of the dream play out this way? I would also say the other striking theme of the Dream Master is that, as I recall, like I think relatively little of the book actually takes place in those sequences. Like very long stretches of it are in the, conscious waking world and more about the psychiatrist character, his relationship with his family, his relationship with this patient outside the dreams. And so there's a lot of, different elements in the book, and the dream part was smaller than I expected.
Yeah, this is my first time reading this, and Roger Zelazny is my favorite author. This is pretty early, and it was expanded from a novella, I think won the Nebula Award. And he always is so cool and always writes with such style and so many mythological allusions and breadth of knowledge. I think he was a psychology major, so he obviously knows his stuff when it comes to psychology. I sort of felt like a lot of this was sort of like added just to get it up to novel length, because a lot of it to me didn't seem necessarily to relate to the central story. But I don't know. Like Sarah, you also read The Dream Master, right? What did you think of it?
Yeah, and something that went through my mind a lot with both of the books, both The Lathe of Heaven and The Dream Master, is a lot of the stuff that in terms of plot is stuff that we've since seen. And a big part of me is like, oh man, I wish I had, read this years ago before my imagination had been spoiled by, movies that have taken these, and run with it, taken these ideas and run with it when they would have been more fresh. But I think one of the things that makes them so charming, both of them, is the richness of language, and that both books are, definitely serious literature. It's not just, a sci-fi story that you might read in science fiction magazine that, has a certain style to it, like PKD, but not an art. That I never found that anyway about PKD. I'm sorry, but it's much more beautiful writing, and I think that it's reassuring in a way, because you're like, on the one hand, a lot of these plots I've seen repeated over and over again, but on the other hand, it almost doesn't matter, because the richness of the worlds that are being created here is unique and descriptive enough and rich enough that you feel, that you're experiencing it from a different perspective.
Yeah, well, so Zelazny, he sold this idea to Hollywood, and he didn't write the screenplay, but they sort of adapted it very loosely into a 1984 movie called Dreamscape, which I did watch. And it's quite illustrative to compare the two, because, the Zelazny book, it's full of, I just wrote down a couple of things, like, you want to read this book, you better know Song of Myself by Walt Whitman, The Lady of Shalott. You better be familiar with mythological figures like Orestes and Corybantes, Jung's concept of Imantia Dromia, Shankara Catechism. All this stuff. And then in the movie version, there's like Dennis Quaid is psychic, and he's like your typical sort of like dickbag, conceited Hollywood hero. And the only reference to anything is a reference to, this is good, the
what is it? The something people. We're told in the movie that the Sonoy people of Malaysia raise their kids to have control over their dreams, and that dreams are central to their culture. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I look up the Sonoy people on Wikipedia, and we find that this whole idea is based on a guy named Kilton Stewart, who wrote a book about the Sonoy, and that he was basically trying to pass off his own New Age ideas as theirs. And this page notes, later researchers were unable to substantiate Stewart's account. The Sonoy themselves have never heard of this theory and have never practiced it. They reject the possibility of dream control as nonsense. So, just giving you an idea of the contrast between the novel and the movie. But yes, also, Sarah was bringing up there The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin. I guess I'll just very quickly describe the premise. So there's an ordinary guy, and he doesn't want to dream because every time he dreams, he wakes up and whatever he dreamed about has come true. And they assign him this sort of government psychologist. This is in some sort of vaguely dystopian future. And the psychologist has a machine that can kind of hypnotize him or do hypnotic suggestion or something to control what he dreams about. And the psychologist tries to use this guy's dreams to create a utopian world. I love this book. I read it 20 years ago. It was actually when I was a student at the Clarion workshop in 99. Tim Powers and Karen Joy Fowler recommended a book, specific book to each person, like a personalized recommendation. And this was the book that they recommended for me. But so let's get Lisa in here. So Lisa, have you read Lathe of Heaven? Do you have any opinions about this?
Yeah. I've read it many times long ago. But yeah, I looked at it again before the show. I like it. I think it's a great story. And I like how human the protagonist is, right? The mad scientist guy who uses him, I find less interesting, but I like that George Orr, right? That's his name. And I like just what a guy he is. I think it's kind of cool. He has this like amazing ability, but he's just such a guy. It's like all he wants is to like get some version of his beloved back. And it's funny that he has this just sort of obviously literally earth-changing kind of power, and what he wants is so humble. There's something about this story I find very powerful in that contrast. Another interesting thing, though, that always happens to me with Lathe of Heaven is I always mix it up with John Varley's Overdrawn at the Memory Bank. And this is just more to my point that I think dream stories and cyberspace stories are kind of the same thing. And it's no surprise to me that they were both made into PBS films right around the same time as well, because they're both about people who are trapped in these realities sort of their making, but not entirely of their own making, and they have to figure out how to negotiate them, which is obviously a metaphor for all of us in the world we continue to live in today when I say that, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to stop right there for a minute then. Go on to someone else.
So Anthony, what'd you think of Lathe of Heaven?
I thought it was great. It was, I'm sort of a little, as somebody who loves Le Guin as much as I do and loves Philip K. Dick, it's a little embarrassing to me that it took me so long to get around to reading it. And I would say that there's a little bit of a sense of, I think sort of the shorthand people sometimes use for the book is Ursula Le Guin doing Philip K. Dick. I guess that's the elevator pitch. And I think that it's not quite, like, I don't necessarily love it quite as much as my favorite Le Guin books or as my favorite Philip K. Dick books, but that's like a really, really high bar because those are basically my favorite books in the world. And this is maybe slightly below that. And I think that in a lot of ways, the dream stuff is not the most interesting thing about the story to me. I mean, there is like, she does a very good job of just showing these shifting realities and going from one world to the next. And George trying to figure out what has happened, because for a long time, he can't even remember what the instructions were that led to this dream and led to this new world. I think what's probably the most interesting about the book to me is that I think there's a fairly common trope in science fiction, both written and filmed, of the person who kind of like wants to change the world is kind of dangerous and scary, and that there's this implicit endorsement of the status quo, that the person who, like the mad scientist who wants to like fight climate change and then it goes horribly wrong. And I think this, and then in a lot of cases, that's not really questioned. It's just the idea of, okay, here's this, radical revolutionary and they must be stopped. Here, I think it's like a really serious exploration of this idea of like, why is this, that the whole time you get the sense that the psychiatrist manipulating the dreams isn't necessarily a great person, but his intentions are good, that he wants to build a better society, that, he certainly does things to benefit himself at the same time, but that most of the big changes he makes are because he thinks it's going to lead to a better world. And George, the dreamer, is very, very committed to this idea that he should not be doing this. And I mean, there's certainly a lot of evidence in terms of just how the world gets very strange and chaotic, that he shouldn't be. But I think this book expresses that philosophy, that idea of like, hey, like if you really want to change the world, be careful what you wish for, better than pretty much anything else I can think of.
Yeah, so actually, let me just explain. So every time the psychologist or psychiatrist tries to change the world, at least after the first couple of times, it goes wrong in some way, like a wish, where like he tries to get rid of racism, and then when George wakes up, everyone has this sort of gray skin, and he tries to create world peace, and suddenly Earth is united against this alien threat that never existed before, stuff like that. I'm glad you said the thing about like, is it not so simple that Haber, the doctor, is the bad guy? Because I don't remember if I just watched the PBS special. It's been a long time since I read the book, so I don't remember if this line is in the book or not. But at one point in the show, Haber says, "We've made more progress in 6 weeks than humanity has in the past 6,000 years." And when he says that, when he says that, I'm kind of like, wow, it's hard to necessarily it's hard to dismiss that out of hands, that point. But yeah, so Sarah, what did you think of Lathe of Heaven?
Yeah, it's funny that Anthony mentioned that, because I think Anthony and I had the same kind of disagreement on Twitter about Watchmen and Lady Tro.
I was thinking of that.
Yeah, because for me, I mean, I actually think it was sort of my favorite part of the book is the tension between these two characters, both of whom are essentially trying to save the world, but one of them is trying to do it in a proactive way, and the other one is trying to do it in a reactive way, in a fixing what happened because of the proactive way. Again, like, one of the things that you're raised with when you're raised religious is the horrible things that can happen when people try to do good, when people have good intentions. And so for me, I not only do I think it's realistic, I think it's an important story to tell in science fiction over and over again, of these characters who, because they're trying to save the world, they make decisions that they're really not equipped to make. They don't have the right to make those decisions. Like it's the same way that, in the Avengers, the character who snaps his fingers and half the world population disappears, that might be a logical decision to make if there were literally no other way, but you don't have the right to make that choice for the people who end up disappeared, right? And so I think that, the tension between those two characters was the most interesting part to me. And also it struck me as it's a very sort of feminine problem to think about, because in a way, sort of the George character was sort of almost feminine, and the doctor character was almost, sort of the masculine way or the controlling way of trying to save the world. Whereas George was sort of saving it in this very introspective way and saying, well, yes, we cured racism by making everybody the same color, but we lost all of this beautiful diversity. We lost all of this texture, and people don't really seem, yes, they're peaceful, but they also just don't seem very interesting anymore. So yeah, I mean, I think that was kind of my favorite part of the book.
Yeah, I mean, on Wikipedia, it describes the conflict in this book, I think, as positivism versus Taoism, which
Taoism, yeah, I was going to say.
Which, I mean, I think that
Sorry.
I think the title is a Taoist reference, but
Yeah.
but it gives you a sense of that this book is actually really about something, and I think that unfortunately the PBS adaptation is so sort of, you know, kind of low budget, and I think it was made in 1980. It's but it feels very 70s. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know how appealing it would be to audiences today, but I feel like a really well done adaptation of this would be the number one dreams and science fiction movie. I mean, it's just about so much more than Inception really is. But so Lisa, I can tell you're anxious to get back in here.
No, I was just going to say, I think there was a Lathe of Heaven update, wasn't there? I'm pretty sure someone actually did do an update, maybe in 2000.
I found references to one that was around 2000, 2002, but it's not. It's only on DVD. I couldn't find any way to easily watch it.
Me neither. Yeah. No, that's what I was going to say.
But it wasn't the PBS 1981, at least, you know, by reputation, is supposed to be better. And I guess Le Guin was more heavily involved with and happier with the 1981.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I don't, but apparently the 2001 wasn't that. I mean, the fact that it's not available would indicate to me it wasn't a smashing artistic success, but, you know, I haven't seen it. I guess I have a bunch of other things I could bring up here. Okay, well, so one thing I wanted to mention is that when you have this idea of the dream master and you know, the therapist going into somebody's dreams to help heal them psychologically, I was describing this premise to my girlfriend Steph, who's really into psychology and stuff, and she was saying, "Oh, is this like Freudianism?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, it was written in 1966, so it's very Freudian." And you know, I think my understanding is that the field of psychology has kind of moved on, and, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy is sort of the state of the art, is my understanding. But I feel like Freudianism and Jungian psychology is so rich for fiction. You know, if you want to tell a story about psychology, I feel like, you know, Freudianism just offers you so much. And this whole idea, like in Lathe of Heaven, that psychologists or therapists are sinister, I feel like it's much easier to tell a story about a sinister therapist in a Freudian context where it's all like, you know, hypnosis and like your dreams and secrets and this kind of sense that you're not in control, and the therapist knows all these things about you that you don't know. And so I thought it'd be interesting.
I'm totally thinking of Dead again.
Yeah, well, so Sarah, do you want to jump in there?
Oh, I was just mentioning, you know, the film Dead Again, the Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson film, which I love. There's all these crazy flashbacks to, you know, when them in the 1940s that are so beautifully done. But that's totally a movie we could have talked about, because, you know, this business of the therapist using hypnosis to go back and, you know, basically back in time for the audience. But then the things that are uncovered that, you know, and the way that these people's lives connect, you know, 40 years later, super fascinating.
Yeah, I'm not familiar.
It's funny because it doesn't, like my own experience with therapy is so completely different. I haven't done a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, but just like sort of general talk therapy feels like the opposite of, like, you know, sinister mastermind pulling the strings, although maybe that just means they're doing it really well. But I think what's also telling, though, is that in both Lathe of Heaven and The Dream Master is that, yes, I think ultimately you sort of, there's a sense that the you know, psychiatrist is either sort of the villain or the anti-hero or you know, it has some sort of tragic flaw. But like in neither case is it that the sort of simple villainy of, and I guess this is what I was talking about a little bit before, of just, hey, I want to use my power to manipulate this person to get what I want. It's much more, oh, I want to, you know, I believe that what I'm doing is the right thing, and that, you know, I have this tremendous power and I want to use it in the right way.
Yeah. I mean, Lisa, what do you think about, do you have any feelings about how science fiction, how real world psychologists relate to science fiction psychologists?
Oh, I have all kinds of feelings about this, but I think that I mean, we see psychology. I was actually thinking about this. We see psychology in dreams as far back as Forbidden Planet. As a lot of you might remember, the key to sort of figuring out that movie, it's a movie from the 1950s where humans have to go to this other planet where there was a scientific expedition. Humans have been supposedly trapped there for 20 years. Most of them died. One is left. They have to try to figure out the mystery of what's happened on this planet. And it all revolves around this machine that can tap into people's psyches and project them. So essentially, your dreams come to life and your nightmares, as it turns out, because one scientist's mind, the mad scientist, right, his mind becomes writ large and wreaks havoc on this world. So I think that that's interesting. And especially because there are certain points within Forbidden Planet where people have dreams and they wake up from them. And later on, you realize everyone's dreams are kind of clues to the larger pattern of what's going on. So we've definitely seen this in science fiction for a while, certainly before Lathe of Heaven and then definitely up through it. I was thinking about, we see a lot of movies or a lot of interest in, right, psychiatrists and dreams throughout the new wave, right? So Le Guin was not the only one writing these kinds of stories in the 1960s and 70s. I think Philip K. Dick is a good example that we chatted about a little bit before this show. We could talk about either Ubik or I think there's another one. Is it the Eldritch Palmer story? I think the Three Stigmata of the Eldritch Palmer. Eldritch. Yeah, that one also is about dreams, right?
What's about sort of drug-induced hallucinations? Yeah,
right. And I think also there's a question of like everything in Dick is sort of dreamlike to an extent.
Yeah. That actually reminds me, I meant to mention too that when I think there used to be this idea that your dreams were in psychology, that your dreams were super, super important and symbolically laden and meaningful. And so the ability to go into someone else's dreams, therefore, would be equally important. Whereas I think a lot of maybe the more modern scientific view is that your dreams are just sort of random. I don't know. They don't really mean anything. No.
I've had dreams that came true. I tend to have rich dreams in general. When I was a child, I was in a furniture store. I was like 9 years old, and I saw a large poster of Picasso's Guernica, and I was sort of captivated by it. It's very stark. It's all achromatic colors. It's visually striking. There's depictions of sort of distorted faces of women and children in pain. And I was struck by it. And I remember staring at it and being afraid of it at the same time. And I went home that night and I had a nightmare about it. And the memory of the dream stuck with me because it was incredibly visually evocative of all of these Picasso-like faces, these, sort of bizarrely shaped faces. But it took me years later. I, found out what the painting was about, that it was about the bombing of civilians in Guernica by Nazis during the Spanish Civil War. And it was an incredibly spooky experience. 2 years later, find out that this nightmare I had about this painting was on purpose. It was because Picasso, wanted to evoke these horrible things that were happening. And me, as a sensitive child, picked up on it on some level subconsciously. So, I've had a number of dreams that, I'll dream something and then 7 years later it will happen. And I'm like, what the fuck? It's crazy. And, so I think that also one of the things that, you have to understand is that different people dream differently. Some people don't remember their dreams at all. Some of them remember them and remember that they went on for what feels like months. Some people have sort of more, sort of more visual dreams than others. So I'm personally fascinated by them.
Well, I mean, this may not be correct, but I just my sense of it is that there's like a growing body of scientific discourse that feels that dreams are just sort of random noise or something. And whether that's true or not, I do wonder if that connects to dreams not being a more popular subject for science fiction books and movies, in the past few decades, and why things, as I think Lisa was mentioning, have moved more in the direction of virtual reality. As sort of, I feel like dreams were sort of I think maybe Lisa made the same point, but we're sort of a proto virtual reality. And then as virtual reality itself becomes more and more of a real possibility, the idea of going into dreams comes to seem less and less intriguing to people.
One of the things that I read about a possible evolutionary purpose for dreams is that if we are struggling with a fear of something, that, if we dream about that fear, even if that fear is terrifying, then in a sense, your brain is sort of rehearsing for whether, to not freak out if this happens. That you are, even if it's just, sort of abstracted dreams about feeling alone or, your family dying and somehow having to live on without them. And that somehow your brain, in processing all of these fears and strange desires and impulses that you might have in your subconscious, is you're rehearsing for dealing with things in the future. And that it kind of gives your brain some cushioning so that we don't literally just collapse and just fall apart when bad things happen to us.
Yeah, I mean, that maybe, does anyone have any strong feelings on whether dreams are important or not, or whether, do people think there should be more science fiction about dreams?
Actually, I think there is more. And I just thought of this right now. And I think what you want to do is look, maybe not so much in science fiction proper, because they are right. Either you have to run it through psychology or the soft sciences or something, or you have to translate it into cyberpunk. But in maybe more some of the other speculative genres like Afrofuturism, I think there's a lot of interest in dreams. And I don't know if any of you know, there's a short story by Fenderson J. Lee Clark called The Secret Lives of the 9 Negro Teeth of George Washington. Do any of you know this story?
I don't.
I do not.
It's a marvelous story. Oh my gosh. I just remembered it. I wish I had remembered it beforehand. I would have recommended everyone read it. But it's an alternate Earth where George Washington, he makes his dentures out of the teeth of his slaves. But each tooth is imbued with the history of that slave. And so he dreams their history every night. And eventually this leads him to free the slaves and start people on the path to what's going to be a Black utopia in their future. And it's a really cool and powerful story. It just came out a couple of years ago, and 2018. And I just taught it to my students, and they just went bananas. They loved it so much. They were like, oh my God, it's like fantasy, but it's science fiction because it's about dentures, and that's a technology, but it's about dreams and history. And it's
That's
a
so
cool story. So yeah, so maybe what we need to be doing, someone had mentioned earlier that dreams seem more aligned with fantasy. And I know Clark sees himself as more of a fantasy writer. So maybe it's in the other genres, in the fellow traveler speculative genres.
Could you just repeat the title and author?
Yes. So this is Fenderson J. Lee Clark. He usually goes by P. J. Lee, D-J-E-L-I. And then his last name is Clark. And the story is called The Secret Lives of the 9 Negro Teeth of George Washington. And if you Google it, you can find copies of it online. And it's a beautiful story. It's amazing. Everyone should go read it. And
That's awesome.
I wish I'd remembered it before. Yeah, it's cool.
Well, if he does a show on Lovecraft Country, he could have people read that as it's very similar.
Wow. Yeah, right? Because there are dreams that are real in Lovecraft Country. That's a great example, Sarah.
Yeah,
talk about that, please.
I haven't seen Lovecraft Country, so I can't comment on it. But I mean, I was kind of curious to talk about dreams in science fiction specifically, because I feel like if you're talking about dreams in fantasy, I mean, there's like an endless, an infinite number of examples. I feel like pretty much any fantasy story probably has some prophetic dream or something in it. Whereas, you could probably hit all the main ones in dreams in science fiction in 90 minutes. That's kind of the idea anyway.
Yeah. Well, that's what I like about the Clark story is it sits right at the crossroads of fantasy and science fiction. It's set in an alternate Earth where magic is real, but they also can tap into alternate realities where science is real, and it's organized around the dentures, right? Which is that's a technological device. So that's pretty cool. It's a much smaller, we started here, right? That it seems to be a much smaller pool of stories in the science fiction world.
Yeah, well,
you got some in the new wave and some in cyberpunk, and then I don't know what.
Well, you did mention, Lisa, 2 examples for us to check out. One was Before I Wake by Kim Stanley Robinson, and the other was The Winter Market by William Gibson. These are both short stories. Anthony, did you read? You read at least one of these, right?
I read both of them.
You read both of them?
I thought I liked both of them. I mean, the Robinson I really liked, and I just thought, I mean, it's so different for him too, because he tends to be much more right in a much more kind of rationalist, realist mode. But this is like his sort of version of, I don't know, like a Dick or Ballard story, like very nightmarish.
You want to just describe
I just
the
thought
premise?
I guess I didn't completely get my head around it, but I think it's essentially that like the people are like, something has happened to like the positioning of the Earth, and so people's brains are working differently, and so like the space between your dreams, your unconscious dream state, and your conscious state has basically been destroyed, and so people are sort of like it's like this character constantly waking up into these like real but incredibly dreamlike environments, or sometimes occasionally it's actual dreams.
Well, yeah, I could have some of these details wrong, but I think the basic idea is that the Earth has somehow passed into some sort of electromagnetic field, some novel electromagnetic field. It's the result of some cosmic phenomenon or something. And it's caused people's brains to sort of be oscillating between normal waking and sort of a REM sleep-like state, where they're basically either awake or sort of sleepwalking and kind of oscillating between the two. And this is a, worldwide phenomenon, which has obviously been incredibly disruptive to human society. And the story focuses on the main character is a scientist who's trying to devise a technological solution to this, and whose physical and mental well-being is deteriorating throughout the story for obvious reasons. So Lisa, do you want to say any more about why you recommended the story?
So I like it because I think in some ways it provides the text for things we see later in The Matrix and in Coma. This idea that if you have the option to choose between the virtual world or the dream world and the real world, sometimes you're going to choose that virtual or dream world, and you have really good reasons for doing so. And I like that it sets out that sort of challenge to which reality we should prefer. Although I think our main character would prefer to be back to real reality at some point. Although good luck with that. The ending suggests maybe. But I'm with Anthony. I thought it was just cool because it's so different than what I usually expect from Stan Robinson as a mundane science fiction writer, as someone who tries to have something very much like literary realism in some ways in his science fiction. And it was just so fantastic and delightful. But having said that, he's also a real fan of poetry, and he's been experimenting with poetry in his recent novels. So in some ways, this felt like an early, almost poetic experience of Kim Stanley Robinson.
Yeah.
So I thought it was cool.
No, I thought it was just
a one-off for sure.
Super cool story. And it's just, it may be sort of out there, as you say, but I mean, it's not, our minds are such a mystery. I guess the characters, I think I wrote it down, the characters in the story make this point. At one point, one of the characters says, "We don't know what dreaming is. We don't know what sleep is. You only have to think about it a bit to realize we didn't know what consciousness itself was, what it meant to be awake."
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think we can't really have confidence that something like this wouldn't happen. Like so much of how our brains work is a complete mystery to us. That could something disrupt it for everybody? I mean, who knows? I think that's what's so scary about the story. And so let's see. So Sarah, you read the other one, right? Winter Market?
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything about that?
Just that, I enjoyed it. Again, it was really well written and rich despite being I think it took me about an hour. So, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's sort of blending together with the other ones at this point. So, but I remember enjoying the characters.
Yeah, so this is William Gibson. I found the audio file, and I only had time to listen to about the first 20 minutes. But I think the thing that Lisa was drawing our attention to was that the main character kind of brings in artists and records their memories and then edits them records their dreams and edits them and sort of sells them as artistic commodities of some sort. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I felt was I was sort of like, I could see myself being the victim of this because, as I have said, I have a crazy dream life. So I'm like, this could totally happen to me.
So none of you got to the end of the story, because that's where, I mean, it's interesting all the way through.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, right. Because, okay, never mind. Because by the end, is she even going to be able to dream and be this guy, right? It's an interesting just sort of take on Hollywood, because that's really, right, what this is where Hollywood could go in this world. But I like the story because I like the idea of dreams becoming commodities. And that's not something we actually see in any of these other stories we've been talking about. They're kind of become these like techno-scientific tools, maybe like a way to get you from one place to another, or a cool location to explore. But the idea that you can just package a dream and sell it like a movie, like, I just think that's pretty mind-blowing, actually. And I bet you $1 million, I don't care how old that story is, if we could have developed that technology today, someone would try to use it this way.
Yeah, and it would be a lot like Strange Days if they did. It's people selling it on the black market and...
Yeah. Yeah. And the idea that people might upload themselves and sell their souls to make this kind of art because they could, like, or their bodies or whatever. I mean, I don't know. It makes sense.
Yeah.
People sell what they can, right? And if you can sell your dreams, geez, I can imagine there would be a market for that for sure. The winter market.
Anthony, was there anything else you wanted to say about that story?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I liked it a lot. I mean, I think Gibson is just a great short story writer. And in some ways, it also felt like an update of one of the other stories I mentioned during the prep, called Dreaming as a Private Thing by Isaac Asimov, which is also about like somebody building a business around sort of productizing your dreams. And
you're right.
One of the things that's sort of striking about both of them to me is how, I mean, partly this is probably just a reflection of length, although Winter Market is actually fairly long, for, I guess, maybe novelette length. But that neither of them really gets into the dream space that much. It's much more about like what the company is, what like the relationships of the different creators are. And you don't actually, like, so in the Winter Market, there is this, forget exactly what it's called, but she has some sort of hit. I don't know what the right word is, like album or dream recording or whatever it is. And you get like very tiny suggestive bits of it, but I think neither Asimov nor Gibson seems to like really want to go into like an extended description of what this dream art might look like. And I mean, the other striking thing about the story to me is just the fact, I mean, Lisa's talked a number of times about the sort of comparisons between dreams and cyberspace, and that in a lot of ways, because it doesn't have that many descriptions of the dream state, it feels like a very typical Gibson story. It's like, instead of cyberspace, there's dream art, but it in a lot of ways you sort of plug the same Gibson concerns and characters around that.
Yeah, well, when you were talking about that was making me think that one idea that recurs in almost every one of these is the idea that if you die in your dream, you die in real life. And I feel like, there's just certain features of dreams that make them hard to dramatize, and one is like, what are the stakes? Because if it just gets too scary, don't you just wake up? And it's sort of like, doesn't make sense and all this stuff. Yeah. And so I think it's interesting that so many of these stories converge on this idea of, in order to introduce stakes, death and danger have to be real, or madness, I guess, would be the other thing.
And that's what I like about Winter Market, because it's also about dreams and death and danger, but it mixes it differently, right? Because at the end, Lise, who is considered to be profoundly disabled by the perspective of her more or less able-bodied world, in the end, she decides to basically sell herself to a Hollywood company and upload her consciousness into a mainframe so she can get out of her body, which is actually deteriorating pretty quickly for a variety of reasons. And right, and the gamble is they don't know if she's still going to be able to dream once she's an AI. And at the end of the story, her human friends, her art friends, won't talk to her anymore because they're scared about that too, and they don't want to know the answer. I just think that that's cool. And because there's still death and danger and dreaming, but it's all organized differently, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so Lisa, do you want to talk a little bit? You had a bunch of stuff about the history of dreams in science fiction.
Yeah.
And going back to Somnium and all this kind of stuff. Do you want to just give us a quick?
Sure. I had, I'm a cultural historian. This is what I do. So I took a look back through history, and it's exactly like what both Anthony and I think Sara mentioned at the beginning, that this is a trope that's been in science fiction since the beginning, since its inception in Western history. But it's also been a pretty small trope with just a very small crew of people dabbling in it for whatever reasons. But having said that, you can go all the way back to 1608 and look at Johann Kepler's Somnium, which used to be considered the first science fiction novel. Now we think it's one of the first science fiction novels. And it's a dream narrative, and it's a dream narrative used to prove scientific points. This was actually part of Kepler's dissertation, what would we now call a PhD defense, when he was getting his doctorate. And he had written about issues of perspective and what it would look like to stand on the moon and look at the Earth. And that was a 68-page handwritten mathematical thesis. And people didn't use numbers in math then. They wrote everything out longhand, which was apparently very confusing, especially when you were translating to other languages. Yes, imagine. So he had written out this mathematical PhD in longhand. And then he wanted to publish it popularly. So he decided to write what we would now call a science fiction novel to demonstrate the principles of it. And that's what Somnium is. And it's a dream narrative. And a number of things happen, but eventually our protagonist, who's a well-trained scientist who's had miraculously the sort of same life that Kepler had himself, falls into a dream and goes to the moon and explores the moon and sees the Earth and proves all these mathematical principles. So, it's something we've seen since the beginning, but it's interesting because the dream, it's not really the dream space. I guess he's dreaming of the moon as a space and he's looking at it, but the dream is also just the way to get him to the moon to prove the mathematical principles. And, we see dreams like that later on in the 19th century. I know we don't want to do fantasy, but I have to mention A Christmas Carol, right? Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, because it's a time travel story, but it uses dreams to move you through time and space. So we see these stories coming on and off. And weirdly, this was like the weirdest thing I found, is that dream narratives were actually popular in science fiction in the early 1930s in amazing stories. After Hugo Gernsback was forced out and his second in command took over, T. O'Connor Sloan. And Sloan was a really well-known scientist and science journalist. And he was all about mundane science fiction before that term ever existed. And he banned faster than light travel from science fiction stories in Amazing. So everyone had to figure out some way to get their people in outer space. And they went back to dream narratives of all weird things. So there you go.
That's
Cool. So yeah, isn't that cool? I found it. So yeah, dreams as a way to travel through time and space. But again, before you have cyberspace or computers to help you do that.
Yeah, you also mentioned Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, which is,
Oh gosh, yeah, of course.
Science fiction.
Totally, right? And again, the narrator, he gets in a fist fight with one of his employees, and the employee chucks a wrench at him, and it knocks him into a coma, and then he travels back in time, right? So again, that trope of the coma, even, yeah, hey, you guys, we just found it goes all the way back to the 1800s. And one other one I would mention is that there's early feminist takes on this too. And Sara, so you'll probably like this one. Weird Tales author Dorothy Quick, she was the second most published woman in Weird Tales in the 30s and 40s. She actually started writing science fiction in the 40s and 50s, and she did a series called the Patchwork Quilt series. And it's about a family of witches that make this patchwork quilt, and they make, and every patchwork is imbued with history. And when you sleep on it and touch it, you travel back to that time and go through that history from the perspective of other women.
That's amazing.
It's pretty cool. Yeah, they're cool stories.
I'll also just mention, I sent you guys this entry from the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, where the entry is called Dream Hacking, and they list a bunch of things. Some of the earliest ones are Peter Phillips' Dreams Are Sacred, 1948 Astounding, John Brunner's City of the Tiger. They mentioned the Zelazny, Pat Cadigan's Mind Players, Kim Newton's The Nightmare, and Greg Bear's Queen of Angels. I used to have Queen of Angels, but I never read it, unfortunately. But have you, do you know anything about any of those?
I've read Queen of Angels, but I don't remember a ton about it. I do remember Pat Cadigan's Mind Players, because that's one that literally merges the cyberpunk and dreaming tropes. And it's kind of the moment when everything crosses over each other. And it's another set of stories about psychologists with questionable intentions. So there you go.
Yeah, I hope no psychologists listening to this take this personally.
No, they're cool though. I mean, no, but not in a bad way. Like in the sort of cool cyberpunk way, just like they're just people in the world. She's not particularly heroic. In fact, she's done some dicey stuff, and so she has to, redeem herself and all that. But they're good. They're very noir. So, throwing another level of storytelling on top of all this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then I haven't read this, but there's a novella by Karen Russell called Sleep Donation, which definitely fits this theme I wanted to mention. But yeah, I think, and then I also watched this anime movie called Paprika, which sort of is the idea of, there's this technology that allows people to share each other's dreams, and then it starts being used kind of as a weapon, and people are attacked by starting to dream while they're awake and, being injured or killed. But I think that pretty much covers, what we had, talked about. Are there any other things, any other concepts or anything that people wanted to mention on this topic?
I guess I just wanted to bring up Ubik again and say that is, now that we sort of thought of that right before coming on, is a great one, because it's, it's similar to Coma in a way, because basically all the characters are in comas. I think you find this out fairly early. This isn't a huge spoiler. But that is, it's just incredibly unsettling and sort of playing with these different layers of reality and the different sort of psychologies of the different characters, and I just highly recommend it.
Yeah, I haven't read. That's one of the Philip K. Dick ones I haven't read, so I'll have to check that out.
Ubik is it's really cool. Yeah, I like it, and again, in some ways, it really reminds me of Winter Market and Pat Cadigan's Mind Players, which of course makes sense since Dick is kind of an early cyberpunk, but it's really thinking about the ways in which cybernetic technologies might interact with not just the body, but the mind, and what kinds of realities that might project. So.
Yeah, cool. I guess also there were just two ideas in Inception I thought were really cool that I want to highlight. And one of them is that the characters carry these things they call totems, which are small objects that are weighted in such a way that only you know. And so if you do it and it doesn't react right, you know that you're in somebody else's dream, because no one else would know how this thing is supposed to behave. So I thought that was a really cool idea. And this idea that certain high-profile individuals would undergo some sort of mental conditioning where their subconscious minds would attack. I guess in the Inception world, everyone's subconscious mind attacks intruders, but you can undergo this conditioning where your subconscious mind arms your projections with machine guns and Humvees and all this kind of stuff. I thought those were both really cool ideas that I haven't seen in any other science fiction. I guess if we have a couple minutes, I could tell my museum story. So I mentioned that.
Yes.
I mentioned that the horse divided into different segments from the cell was this actual art exhibit, and there was this exhibit called Sensations, and it was supposed to be kind of confrontational art, and one of the pieces was a picture of the Virgin Mary done by an African artist who used elephant dung, I think in most or all of his paintings. And so this became a big controversy when they exhibited it. And Rudy Giuliani, who was mayor of New York at the time, actually shut down a couple subway stops to make it harder for people to get to the museum. And so then, just like on principle, my parents and I went to this exhibit. And it was wild. I don't know if there's probably still some webpage you could look at to see all the stuff, but it was pretty wild. But so we're there, and so we saw the Sensations exhibit, and then we went down. They had a different exhibit, more kind of conventional exhit on the floor below. And while we were down there, we saw all of these security guards go charging up the stairs, and we're like, "Whoa, what's going on?" And somebody had attacked the piece I described, the Virgin Mary painting, had attacked it with white paint. And it was behind a plexiglass shield, and there was a guard stationed there permanently. And nevertheless, somebody attacked it while we were there, and we saw the response. So,
man,
so that's my story.
The piss Christ all over again. The crucifix that is, in the bottle of urine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Freak out.
I mean, I could be wrong, but I mean, the piss Christ was intended to be provocative, whereas I'm not sure that this...
It was, yeah.
I'm not sure that this one... I could be wrong about this, but my understanding is that this was not intended necessarily to be,
well, and it's funny that, these people apparently never looked at the ingredients of what's in paint, because there's lot of weird shit in paint. In order to get those pigments, you got to crush up, a lot of bizarre things, beetles, and, there's definitely poop in paint. It's just, in normal paints, it's just, there's all sorts of weird shit in there. So literally.
Weird shit, literally. All right, cool. Well, so I know people have to go pretty soon. So why don't we start wrapping this up? So how about just some final thoughts on this whole project of watching dreams in science fiction movies and reading the books and everything? So, Sarah, final thoughts.
My therapist told me I should start writing down my dreams. And then I read the next day that Vladimir Nabokov used to write his dreams down on index cards. Because, of course, he wrote everything on index cards because it allowed him to shuffle the order of things. And so he kept a stack of index cards next to his bed. And in the morning, he would write down any dreams that he had. And so that is actually a practice that I would like to adopt because, my therapist was basically like, look, you have all of these really rich dreams. Why don't you ever, keep a notebook of them, keep track of them? And I was like, I don't know. It never occurred to me. And now that, we've had this podcast and everything, I was like, I really probably should do that. So if you also have rich dreams, that's something that you can do.
I'm going to get this wrong. There was somebody like Henry Ford or somebody like that who would, just as a habit, he would fall asleep holding like metal balls in his hands so that when he fell asleep, they would fall on the floor and wake him up because he wanted to spend as much time as possible. I think it's called hypnagogic sleep or something in the state kind of between being fully asleep and fully awake. Because a lot of your most creative thinking happens when your brain is kind of in that place.
Yeah, it's wild.
Actually, Lisa, you said it was funny. You said in one of the emails, I sent you guys the list of all the books I read and movies I watched, and you said your husband said like, "How am I okay?" or something. What was that?
Yeah. Well, I read him the whole list of everything you had gone through because I was so impressed. You had basically looked at everything we've been talking about for the last 2 weeks, and my husband is also a science fiction professor and a former science fiction editor too, in a small way. Was like, well, ask Dave now. How does he feel after all of that? So, Dave, how do you feel after watching so many dream narratives and reading them? and thinking them. Maybe we should ask all of ourselves that. How are you feeling? Very strange? Something else?
I feel all right, but yeah, he was wondering if my sense of reality, if I was losing my grip on reality or that
Yes.
something. Yeah.
Well, right. Yeah. And I mean, this is an interesting time to be talking about all this, especially as we begin to talk about like social media bubbles and people constructing their own like news realities and things like that. It feels kind of weirdly timely to talk about dreams in a whole bunch of different ways and different registers, quite frankly. But yeah. How does it feel to talk about dreams?
You can tell him that I am not okay at all.
Oh, Sara, no, how come? Why not? Oh, no. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Sometimes it's okay to be not okay. Do you know what I mean? Are you feeling very strange?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've always been sort of fascinated by is that when I decided that when I sort of deprogrammed myself from the religion in which I was raised, I was perfectly happy to just accept that there are lots of mysteries in life. And I love mysteries. And I'm okay with leaving them open-ended. And a lot of the people I went to Christian school with had to replace that Christianity thing with something else. One person got super into horoscopes. One person got way into Satanism. But they needed to replace that thing with something else that was equally, going a little bit probably too far. And so I was very happy to just be comfortable with the fact that we don't know what happens after death. We have no idea, as Nabokov said, life is a great surprise. I don't see why death shouldn't be more of the same. So.
But I think that's so great. And maybe that explains why, I mean, thinking about what Sara just said, isn't this exactly why we don't see that many dream narratives in science fiction? Because science fiction at its heart wants to explain everything, right? Like it's not about the mystery. It's about unraveling the mystery and explaining the mystery. And dreams are not explicable, right? You can barely articulate your dreams in any meaningful way. And science fiction's all about articulating the real.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense. And that would explain why there's a lot more of it in fantasy, because you can just do so much more with it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I hadn't actually thought about that, but yeah, the kind of people who write science fiction, especially hard science fiction, are maybe not the kind of people who are as interested in dreams as other people. All right, but let's get a final thought. Anthony, any final thoughts?
Sure. I would say that actually, just to tag on to that, to me, what is interesting about a lot of the things that we talked about today, even if, some of them, particularly some of the movies, are not entirely successful, is the way that they're able to bring this kind of this interest in the surreal and the psychological into a sort of more, quote unquote, rationalist genre. And so for that reason, I would actually revisit my earlier statement about Inception and say that Inception is not weird enough and is not psychological enough and is not surreal enough. So it is not my number one dream movie. And I'm going to go with Lisa and go with the Cell.
Yeah, well, it's
oh, wow.
It's interesting because when Inception came out, I remember really distinctly there was they asked some dream experts what they thought of it. And the dream experts basically said what you're saying, that it's not weird enough to be dreams. But the one thing that they really liked was the part where Leonardo DiCaprio was in the big, big mansion or whatever, and it just water starts pouring in, blasting in through all the windows. And it's because his body is being pushed into a bathtub full of water. And they said that sort of the intrusion of sensory data into the dream, that was really realistic. Whereas a lot of the other stuff, was made a good thriller, but didn't really, express what dreams are really like. So that's always stuck with me. But so Lisa, final thought?
Sure. I thought maybe I'd said my final thoughts, but I can do this again. I feel like such a professor here. I'm like, well, let me summarize what I said earlier. No, but actually what has been really cool for me as we've been exploring this was to see that even though it's a minor theme in science fiction, it's certainly one that I think is really productive because of that tension between the rational and the irrational in some ways. Like it can be addressed through literariness or through sort of a deep dive into certain kinds of psychological exploration. I think there's a reason new wave authors and cyberpunk authors have maybe dealt with dreams more successfully than other science fiction authors. But even having said that, it's cool that I felt like if you look over the history of it, like in every period, people do what they got to do with dreams to make it work for science fiction. So in the 1800s and early 1900s, right, which was all about transportation, they're like, yeah, dreams are a vehicle. They get you places. And I'm like, yeah, why not? You know, I mean, of course, sure. And then they become locations, right? Once we get to the 60s and 70s and 80s, both as we're getting into like psychology as a sort of popular party game, like, right, everyone likes to play with psychology and look at dreams and things like that. And then, of course, like I said, cyberpunk, virtual reality feels like our dreams translated onto the screen or something like that. And it's interesting to see that dreams don't seem to have just a sort of single meaning or value in science fiction, but that they can be used in a number of different ways, none of which seem to actually accord with how dream psychologists talk about dreams. So cool. Or interesting, at least.
Yeah, that's cool. And I actually, I didn't know that your husband also was a science fiction professor, so that's interesting. So we'll have to talk about, let's not do it now, but let's talk about that sometime. I'd be curious to hear more about that.
No. Oh, no. And we named our child after a cyberpunk protagonist. It's a horrible housework. It's terrifying.
And so that's I don't know. It sounds pretty cool to me. But why don't we wrap things up there? So we've been speaking with Anthony Ha, Sara Lynn Michener, and Lisa Yaszek. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Always fascinating.
Thank you.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Anthony Ha, Sara Lynn Michener, and Lisa Yaszek for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.